Moving forward, our second speaker for today is who I think is a futurist, and one of the challenges that we all are facing with non-clarity of what's happening in a digital life, which is almost a reality today. The Mahesh Murthy, he's been in the industry for long. He worked his way up into the ad world with Grey India and with Ogilvy in Hong Kong. As a creative director, Mr. Murthy won various awards in Hewlett-Packard, for The Economist, for Pepsi and MTV. From Asia, he moved to Silicon Valley with CSK Partners, where he helped launch the first commercial version of Yahoo way back in 1995, and the Earth's biggest bookstore campaign of Amazon. After successful NASDAQ IPO, Mr. Murthy moved to head marketing at iCat, an e-commerce firm subsequently acquired by Intel. Mr. Murthy returned to India with Channel V. He started his career in active investment in 2000 when he founded Passion Fund and focused on a lot of early startups. Mr. Murthy made successful investments in companies like Geodesic, EBS Direct, Compass Box, and WebDunia. Mr. Murthy then set up Pinstorm, a pay-for-performance digital brand management firm. Pinstorm is today amongst the world's leading digital marketing firms. Mr. Murthy has contributed significantly to print, television, how we all are interacting today. So it's my pleasure to welcome Mahesh Murthy on the dais and share with him his learnings and his insights.
Thank you again. Actually, a lot of what Mr. Sanjay Reddy said actually will probably support a few things I'm saying. I don't have a deck. I will try to make a few points out here. I wear two hats. Thank you very much for that introduction. One, I help run a digital branding practice. Probably more interestingly, I also invest in startups. I run a fund called Seed Fund, and through that I've invested in maybe, and personally to about 50 companies. Some have done better than others. So what I'm really going to spend a little time about is talking about what I think makes companies succeed in this day and age, and how it's completely different from anything I learned when I got into business 30 years ago. First of all, I'm happy to be in Hyderabad. Thank you again for having me here. This is my hometown. I was born here, brought up here, and I've lived around the world. It's good to come back here. When I grew up, when I started working in the early 80s, it was generally told to us that, you know what, competition is growing. And in any segment, you know, competition is only going to increase. And most of you probably still believe it today. In fact, in several segments, if I take the car business, if I take the pharmaceutical business, if you take the car business, globally, Toyota is number one with some 21% market share. And Volkswagen Group is number two with 20% market share. And General Motors is number three with 19% market share. And so on and so forth. It's the same story with pharmaceuticals, same story with many, many other industries. Same story with Coke, Pepsi, and so on and so forth. But what's really interesting is if you take the businesses that have started or that have flourished in the last 5 years, something really interesting, very different is happening. If instead of carbonated soft drinks where there's Coke and Pepsi, if I take energy drinks, Red Bull has a 46% global market share, which is 4 times larger than Coke and Pepsi combined, or Coke and Pepsi's energy drinks combined. Instead of cars that run on petrol and diesel, if I take electric cars and if I take luxury electric cars, Tesla has a 98% market share and BMW has 1%. Instead of all the fashion brands out there that were fighting 10 years ago, today the world's biggest fashion brand is Zara with $22 billion in sales. And Calvin Klein has $2 billion in sales. If I move from the realm of offline and retail as we know it to the new era, the difference is even more stark. Google has a 90% plus market share globally. Who's number 2 in search? Who's number 3? You know, once upon a time when we grew up, somebody say, you know, this person runs a number 10 pharma company in India. He runs a number 15 jewelry company in India. And each of these persons would be probably a centimillionaire or on India's richest list. But guess what? You can't even name the number 3 search engine company worldwide. Forget India. In terms of video, YouTube has 85% market share. I bet you can't name number 2. I bet you can't name number 3. In terms of social networking, Facebook has 80% market share. Google Plus has maybe 5, 10, 15%. In terms of mobile messaging, WhatsApp has 75% market share, and WeChat has about 20%. And I don't know if, Viber and others are number 3, number 4. In story after story, you see exactly the same thing happen. If I take malls, in the traditional world of malls, there's a large mall in Minneapolis, which is the largest in the world. But if I take the digital world of malls and stay outside China, eBay has 80% market share. There's something really interesting that's happening. We grew up in a world where we thought that the leading company would get 20% market share, the number 2 guy would get 18%, and 16%, and 14%. And we were told that competition would rise. So you would think that in any segment, the number 1 company in the world would have 5 or 10% market share, then 9, then 8, then 7. But actually the opposite is happening. The really interesting thing that has happened, that I see happening, is what I call the dominance of dominance. For the first time, and entirely unexpectedly, people now can have 85%, 90%, 95% market share. In microblogging, one company called Twitter has 100% market share. There is not another microblogging company in the world. There is not. Who's the competition to Twitter? Nothing. Right? So what's really, really interesting is not just in the online world, but in the offline world, the rule now no longer seems to be 20%, 18%, 16%. It seems to be that the first company can hope to get 80%, 85% market share. The next company gets 8.5% market share. The third company gets 0.85% market share, or thereabouts. Once upon a time, if you were number 10, you mattered. Increasingly in the future, if you're number 3 also, you're not likely to matter. This is crazy. All right? We moved from a world where we thought we all had opportunity, but somewhere in front of us, these sands of change are blowing, and they're blowing in a way which rewards really, really, which rewards you in a really virtuous way, where if you do it right and strike it right, you get 80%, or you can hope to get 80% market share in some niche. That's been one of the most fascinating changes. In my own investing life, I invested in Redbus. Many of you might have heard of it. We sold the company, it had 88% market share. Right? We invested in Carvalho. When we sold it had 90% market share. We have India's largest chain of dental clinics with 140 dental clinics, well on its way to dominant market share and so on and so forth. And even the brands that we work with. So on the one hand, we really push the brands to say, can you get that extraordinary dominant market share out there? It's there. It's waiting to be taken. So now let's take the second point, saying, what is going to help us take that market share? How do you win that market share? And there's something really interesting that you'll see out there. Whether it's Red Bull, whether it is Zara, whether it is Tesla, or any of these terrestrial brands, there's something really interesting about all of them, especially in terms of how they built their brand. They built their brand with almost no advertising. It's very strange. For somebody, I spent most of my life in places like Ogilvy and Grey, telling a lot of my clients to spend a lot of money on media. But it's really strange. You've never seen a Zara ad. You've never seen a Tesla ad. Let me take it to the digital world. You've never seen a WhatsApp ad. You've never seen an ad for Google. You've never seen an ad for Facebook. You've never seen an ad for any of these dominant brands. The strange but very strange, odd rule that seems to be happening is the brands that tend to spend more today are the brands that tend to die first. The brands that don't tend to spend more are the brands that somehow end up winning. It's in complete contrarian position to the world that I grew up in. You haven't seen a Zara ad. You haven't seen an eBay ad. None of these brands actually launched with any advertising. So it's something really, really interesting. They do marketing, but they don't do advertising and they don't do media spends. So how did these brands grow? How did you ever hear about these brands? These brands have really taken advantage of this one incredible thing out here, directly or indirectly, that we are all connected to, called the internet. 4 billion of our 7 billion people already are on it. And the other 3 billion, I'm sure, hear of it from the other 4 billion who are already on it. This is not to say that Zara is an internet brand. The really interesting thing is each of these brands has grown through only one mechanism, and that is word of mouth. You never saw a Google ad, but somebody said, why don't you Google it? You never saw a WhatsApp ad, but somebody said, hey, get on WhatsApp. You never saw a Zara ad, but somebody said, hey, you must go to Zara. So each of these brands has figured out that little button that makes one person tell another person, you must try this brand out. And it's human nature. We tend to trust the advice of a stranger far more than the advice of a paid evangelist on a testimonial. You know, do you really believe Shah Rukh Khan drives an I-10? You don't, all right? But if your friend says it's a good car, you'll buy it. If your friend says it's not a good car, you're not going to buy it. So a lot of this is really understanding how to capture and how to harness that power of word of mouth. Now, what comes behind that word of mouth? What has created this word of mouth? As somebody who invests in maybe 4 or 5 dozen companies already, I spent a lot of time figuring out what is it that I need to fund my businesses to do. We grew Redbus to 850 crores without a single ad. In actual revenue, middle class bus ticketing revenue, where the average ticket size was 500 rupees, right? 550 rupees for a bus ticket. It was all bought online. So we're not talking about super elite. In the super elite, the numbers are much higher. So we're talking about actual middle class purchases. All right? So what was really interesting in each of these cases, that these brands got word of mouth because in some way, knowingly or unknowingly, and mostly knowingly, they were designed to be remark-worthy. They were designed from the get-go to say, is there something in your offering? Is there something in your product that's going to generate word of mouth? Are people going to talk about it? You're beginning to see, even in our politics, this happening. The entire rise of the Aam Aadmi Party in Delhi, the fact that they won 67 seats 1 year after being washed out in Parliament, right, was with a zero advertising budget, shows that there is something out there that is happening. And the rickshaw-wallahs voted for them, right? It's not just about the elite having access to internet-driven word of mouth. So what generates this word of mouth, and how can this word of mouth work for your brand? There are basically two ways that I have seen that go into this entire mechanism of generating word of mouth for your brands. The first one, it sounds very simple to say, is just extraordinary and deep consumer insight. What is it you know about your consumers? What is it that you understand about the consumers that the other person hasn't yet understood about the consumer? All right? And what is it that you've done to be able to figure that out? And this is something as simple as you know, in the case of my dentist, which is a chain of dental clinics, we figured our problem was with getting people into the dental clinic. And we talked to people, and they kept saying, well, I don't need to go to the dentist, I'm fine. But when we really probed further, we figured that people were insecure, saying, well, I don't know. What if they find something wrong? And, you know, with my teeth, and I have to spend 10,000 bucks. I'd rather not spend 10,000 bucks. I'd rather go by the dentist clinic without going in. So we solved the problem in the craziest possible way. When we designed the dental stores, first we had a price list for dental clinics, right? And second, we put the prices outside on the wall before you entered the shop. And the third thing, the prices had an entry price which said, teeth cleaning 200 rupees, right? Anybody who walked by said, teeth cleaning 200 rupees, you know, that's less than like a nice plate of biryani somewhere. Let's go and see what it is. So you go in there, you get your teeth cleaned, and nobody pushes you to upgrade. You come out saying, man, that was great. I'm going to go back for 800 rupee procedure, then I'm going to go back for a 1500 rupee procedure. And today we have, you know, the typical average break-even period for a clinic is 4.5 months, including all the capex that's required. Hence, we're able to be really, really fast and grow extremely fast because we got down to really understand what the nub of the problem is. Ditto, in bus tickets, what was the problem? Again, the issue we figured was that if you're in Bombay, and I'm now a Mumbaikar, so I can probably use that example. If you want to go to Kolhapur, the earlier way was you would go to Dadar bus stand, figure out which bus is going to Pune. Somebody said that bus, you got onto the bus, went to Pune. You got off at Pune and said, which bus is going to Kolhapur? Somebody said, aaj nahi hai, kal. So you figured out a place to stay and took the next morning's bus to Kolhapur. What we said was, could we just get all the buses in India and have the database available and just allow people the same kind of reservation that they can do on trains? So while everybody else was advertising, we instead sent our people on the ground and signed up over 1,200 operators, all right, and made sure that if you wanted a bus from Bombay to Pune and Pune to Kolhapur, we could show it to you in one simple interface, all right? And what we could do is allow you to actually take a numbered seat. You could get 14A, 14B, 15A. We gave people the idea that we had all the seats, but actually all we did with the operator was said, give us 4 seats, the middle 2, you know, 2 and 2, which are between the wheels. So we had only 4 seats per bus, but we sold out every single one of them. The other thing we did that was really interesting from an e-commerce point of view, for something, a category as boring as intercity bus tickets, we were fighting against Make My Trip, which was public and had a huge amount of money. We had almost no money. As a fund, we put all of 7 crores into Redbus. So we knew that Make My Trip's conversion rate was 3%. That means for every 31 or 33 people that entered the Make My Trip store, 1 bought. So the simple question we asked ourselves was, why is it that 32 people out of 33 are not buying? So we started optimizing our site. Every week we changed the site and loaded a new one. We did this over 7 years. Again, when we sold it last year, our conversion rate was 28%. To my knowledge, that's among the highest in the world in e-commerce, which basically meant that out of 4 visitors, 1 bought on that visit. All right? But even now, the founder whom I talked to, who since left the company, says, I still don't know why the other 3 are not buying. Let me work on that. But as a result of taking your conversion rate instead of 3% to 28%, you have to spend 1/10 the amount. Well, the other guy has to attract 33 visitors to make 1 sale. You have to attract only 4 visitors to make 1 sale. So you're able to sell a lot more for a lot less. So the first point was really this entire idea of having some consumer insight. You're in the diamond business. What is the consumer insight? Certainly the diamond business today is very different from that in my father's day or in my mother's day. If diamonds are here to mark relationships and key points in relationships, you must understand that we have a country that is changing and our very notion of relationships is changing. We have a prime minister who is married but actually single. We have a chief minister of Tamil Nadu who's single but perhaps married. All right? We have, we have people who have relationships that know that will never end in marriage, but they still have those relationships. We have women who are proud to be single in their 30s and beyond, who have significant earning power from the time they're 21. Do we have products that are designed for any of these needs? There are these and many, many, many other such absolute niche custom needs. Why does everybody just seem to be designing jewelry, saying, okay, I'm just going to design this for a marriage of 2 very wealthy people from very wealthy families? Yes, you can get your high-value pickups from there. But how are you going to get your frequency? How are you going to get your word of mouth? And just how much word of mouth can marital jewelry, really generate? Can you have a lot many more occasions where diamonds can be picked up, right? I think there's an interesting challenge. You have a product out there. You have a really nice offering. I was joking with Sachin earlier, saying, when he came and met me a few weeks ago, I said, diamonds are forever. He says, yes, we're bringing back that line. Well, there's something really interesting out there. What is it you can do? You know that those relationships probably don't last forever now in India, but the memories can last forever. So what is it you can do to say, okay, fine, let the memory last forever, and let this diamond mark that memory? The second way we talked about really building this extremely word-of-mouth driven brands is to focus on one thing and not be distracted. Let me give you a little example. 3-4 years ago, WeChat came into India, launched something which had, while WhatsApp was only doing text, WeChat said, I'll do text, I'll do audio, I'll do video, I'll do file sharing, I'll do everything. I'll do mobile to tablet, tablet to desktop, desktop to mobile, I'll do everything. WhatsApp just said, my only focus is I want to be reliable communication between 2 mobile phones. So even now when you switch on your WhatsApp, the first thing that lights up is your WhatsApp counter, because they figured out the first byte that goes out should be theirs, and the first byte that comes in should be theirs. By focusing on one thing and having fewer features than everybody else, they won that business. Same with Apple. Focus on one thing. You don't have to have as many features as the other guy, but you will win that business, right? You don't have to say, they have A, B, C, D, E. I need A, B, C, D, E, and F. You can just have F and AB, it's okay. The third thing that's really interesting about the nature of businesses is each of these dominances is somewhat short-lived. Till 5 years ago, you thought nobody could topple Microsoft, and now Microsoft is fighting to be relevant again. Till 8 years ago, you thought IBM was unsurpassable, but then IBM is really fighting for survival again. The really interesting thing about the companies out here that are really making things different is that they are expanding and they're planting seeds for new businesses of the future which have nothing to do with their current businesses. Take a company like Google. It started with search, it won search, and then decided to do something entirely different, mail, which has nothing to do with search. And they went and won mail with Gmail. Again, they launched Gmail, and they launched this entire thing with no advertising. The whole world changed to Gmail because they figured one consumer insight: we are pack rats, we don't like deleting mail, so let's give everybody 1 GB of space. The whole world moved. 500 million people moved to Gmail. They won mail, and so what do we do? And they went to something completely different, and they won maps. All right? They won maps and said, now let's do social networking. They went there, but they lost to Facebook. So okay, it doesn't matter. We've lost social networking, let's win mobile phones. They went and won Android. 1.2 billion phones around the world use their operating system. From Android, they went and said, okay, let's figure out driverless cars, and they won that business. What is the connection between driverless cars and search engine and maps, right? And email? Nothing. Actually nothing from a technology point of view. The really interesting thing is, what winning companies out here are doing is saying, you know what, let me throw a seed, and let's see if it catches, if that plant takes root out there, let me run and go and build a big business out of that plant. The old world thinking of saying you have to take a small step, you have to do a brand extension only in an area where you're known for, is really not that valid anymore. Look at Apple. It started making desktop computers. It moved to make laptop computers, then moved to make a music player, which it invented that category, won that category, then made a phone, the touch phone, it invented that category and won that category, and now they're getting into watches. And I know many luxury watch retailers, because we work with a few of them, who are very worried about what the Apple Watch can do or what any other watch can do. There's no connection whatsoever between a laptop and a watch and a music player and a desktop at all. Right? There's no manufacturing similarity. There is really no competence other than understanding the consumer and understanding what produces delight. There's a very simple metric even out there. We all loved the iPhone 1, the iPhone 2, the iPhone 3, and the iPhone 4 because it had extraordinary word of mouth. The first parity product that Apple brought out was the iPhone 5, which was not probably as far ahead as anything else, so they had to advertise it. And they've hugely advertised the iPhone 6 because it is less than parity compared to the competition. Therein is a lesson. If your product is at parity or below parity, you have to spend a huge amount of money, all right? You're not going to make that much money. Apple's stock price dropped about $17 yesterday, by the way. And if you're able to figure out something that can generate tremendous word of mouth, you can make that money, right? So the trick comes down to now, how do you figure out how to generate that word of mouth? How do you generate something remark-worthy? A lot of the inspiration is, again, from, in some cases, the earlier speech by Sanjay Reddy of GVK. It has to start with the top. You gentlemen and ladies are the owners of your businesses. Unless you take absolutely, the leading role in saying, we will change, we will drive change, we will make sure this change happens, it's not going to happen. For a lot of people, it's about saying, let me hire a junior and say, well, go ahead and do something. But that's never going to work. Because unless you drive change from the top and you control it, it's not going to be able to go down. The first people that need to change are not the juniors. They're already there in their lives. They're out there on Twitter and Tinder and Facebook all the time. What needs to change is you and your board of directors, right? The second thing you need to do is to be able to say, okay, fine, let me try a few things. Put aside maybe 3, 4, 5%. That's not much, 3, 4, 5% of your profits. And put it away into something that you say, planting these seeds for the future. Try something different. Try out this theory. Well, the whole world celebrated same-sex marriages. Do you want to be the first person in India who actually celebrates by creating jewelry for same-sex marriages? Why not? Look at the amount of noise you would make. Everybody would come to interview you, and you get far more noise, and actually probably sell a hell of a lot more heterosexual-based jewelry than you would normally, just by simply being able to get the noise. Where are the opportunities for noise making out here that you can take? Third, hiring. A lot of people want to hire people with a set experience. My question to you, and one thing I find with all the startups I invest in, is the only one thing I look for hiring is I say, is there a comfort with ambiguity? What does that mean? I personally don't know what the future is going to bring. All I know is it's going to change virtually on a daily basis. I want somebody out there who can actually change that world as it's happening. To use that earlier simile, a simile that was used earlier, like Mr. Reddy talked about doing open heart surgery on a marathon runner in the middle of his race. So you have to actually, the analogy we use is you have to build the bicycle while you're riding it. You have to rebuild the bicycle. So do you have people who are very happy with ambiguity? You say, you know what, this is what it seems like. I have visibility for the next 2 months, 3 months. I can't see beyond that. And after that, I'll keep thinking I'll change. And that's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. That's really what I look for, as opposed to saying, people saying, I don't have certainty and I can't move. Or somebody saying, you have to give me orders only, then I'll move. The right kind of people to always get in your company are people who are very comfortable with the fact that there is ambiguity, that there's nothing clear and there's nothing absolutely definite about the future. All right? When I talk about all of these, you will really then understand the power of insight to be able to see who walks into your store. Again, there's lots of opportunities out there. I do know that, I understand that some people from Cara Lane are here. So there are so many opportunities for jewelry and diamond retailing and e-tailing that are unheard of. So I do know that my colleague's sister in my fund, she comes from a well-to-do family. This is in a very small town called Pantnagar, which is in about a few hours from Delhi, half an hour flight from Delhi. The thing is, almost no jewelry retailers in the town. She buys jewelry online because it's entertainment. She has nothing else to do in that little town. What does a well-to-do family do if you're in Machilipatnam, or if you're in Rajahmundry, or if you're in Guntur? What can you do? There's only 1 or 2 or 3 malls you can go to, right? What you will do is you will buy online. With most of the companies, including my own, you will find, I have found that there's an unreasonably high preponderance of sales coming from B, C, and D towns. And the only reason we can kind of back calculate for that is people are bored there. And e-commerce is really entertainment because there's nothing else to do in that city. They can't keep coming to the big city. They can't keep coming to Delhi or Hyderabad to buy stuff. They'll go online, buy stuff because it's fun. This also backs up the stuff. We looked at eBay numbers. For the first 7 years, the largest category in terms of value and volume in eBay in India was jewelry. Right? A lot of people, now you may say brand and reputation and so on and so forth, but there are brands that have built themselves successfully and people are willing to try. So if you believe nobody is going to spend 25,000 rupees online, you'll be really mistaken. People spend a lot more than that in India very comfortably from small towns, and they're not the digerati. They're very simple people who have built trust over time that, yes, if I order it, it gets delivered. So from that point of view, what's your role if you really want to look at e-tail? There is a market there to be taken, right? Also, what other role? I mean, I have friends who are Sindhi jewelers who don't keep an establishment but come to your house or come to your office and show you jewelry. Is there really the equivalent of the cash on delivery system, which is almost really the merchandising on, let me do it on a house-to-house basis, where you have to hire a different kind of people? I do know that one of the larger people who makes bespoke suits in Bombay has no office. They send people to your residence to measure you up. Because which executive today has a time in the world to go to a mall and stand in front of a tailor to get measured? Nobody. He'd rather say, come home, get it done, and go. And they pay actually more for this. And you don't have to necessarily spend on real estate for that to happen. There are many, many, many categories that are coming out there. There's an entirely new Indian consumer public that's really happening. And to put this in perspective, we are today about 300 million internet users in India, out of which 235 million are already on mobile phones. Let me put this in perspective. There's only 110 million TV sets in India. And if you put even 2 viewers per TV set, there are more people on the mobile internet in India than there are viewers of television. There are 25–30% more people who are on the internet in India than there are viewers of television in India. All of this is 4 times the number of readers of English papers in India. There's a world that's changing. That 236 million will become 500 million in a few years' time. Everybody out here in India will be connected. Every smartphone in India probably in the next 3 years, every phone in India will be a smartphone. As we get Reliance and Jio and 4G, there'll be cheaper bandwidth coming down the wire to everybody. My maid is on WhatsApp. I have friends who actually run agricultural portals where farmers sell their produce, where 25 to 30% of all sales happen via WhatsApp. The farmers are on WhatsApp. All right? This is not just an urban story. The real wealth and the real buying power in India has moved online. And maybe the questions to ask yourself is, what is it that you can do to be able to look at your business? What is going to get you that word of mouth? What is going to get you that extreme, remarkworthiness where people talk about you? And what's going to make you dominant in that space? There's no longer one space. There are 100 different spaces probably in diamond jewelry alone. And there's probably room for 100 different leaders in each of those 100 different spaces. Which one are you going to take up? I think it's exciting times from the point of view of somebody who invests in companies or builds brands. It's tremendously exciting for me. I hope I was able to share some of that with you. And I hope this is some thought and some food for thought for the days and weeks and hours ahead. Thank you. My name is Mahesh Murthy.
If there are any questions from Mahesh, if anybody would like to ask anything specific. Yeah. Can you have the mic, please?
Thanks for this lovely insight into the digital space and motivating us. It's one of the most challenging things to take jewelry online, and especially in the higher end. My question to you is that in this whole changing world, it's moving very fast. We, like you rightly said, are reinventing ourselves. And what we find is that as the younger generation is getting into it, the way business is done is completely different. It's sometimes very difficult to change a larger business so fast. You can see this in soft drinks where Coke is lost to Red Bull. And traditional businesses do find to move the ship to different waters not that easy because it's unknown terrain. So coming to the part. Okay.
Somebody really likes your question.
And you know what? I've not even got there. Anyway, so the question here is that talking to the next gen, the younger gen, and seeing what they think of relationships and commitments and ideas, I find that the thought processes of how the business is run is very different. And the general mindset in all of us who are in this business, in brick and mortar business, really don't get the concept of how your business is valued anymore. So you've sold many of these businesses where the word valuation doesn't come about on how much profit you make, but how much revenue you generate and how much losses you make. Now that's something very difficult for someone to understand, where you're saying from building a business that is at a value of 10 rupees, for example, you're better off being minus 100. You could be practically bankrupt, but you're better off. So that's a very difficult challenge to live with. And I would really like your insight, because you built these kind of businesses and profitably sold them. So it would really help all of us here.
Sure. I'm not a big believer in valuation for the sake of valuation. Much like in any other business, I'm much more of a traditionalist. I believe you have to build value, and if you build value, valuation will come. But there is a group of people for whom the entire idea of a business is topi. Like, kisi aur ke sar pe topi dal do, right? So what you do in those cases is, the theory is called the greater fool theory. Let me build it up to an unsustainable level, and then find a greater fool to buy it from me, and I'll exit the business, right? But it's normal. I mean, I was just talking today where I saw a really interesting thing. An e-commerce company sent an ad to my inbox saying 100% cash back plus additional 20% cash back. That means 120% cash back on an item I buy. Essentially means they're paying me 20% for taking the item for free for them, right? This to me is really a valuation business where somebody out there has been told, just get the number of customers, doesn't matter if you make no money, right? I do believe that there are short-term investors who will buy into that, but I don't. I'm happy to sell into that. I'm not happy to buy into that. So there is no one draining philosophy. I believe in many ways, and I could be castigated for saying this, that the difference between, say, an Amazon and a Flipkart is an Amazon to me is in the business of selling goods and services. A Flipkart to me is in the business of selling its shares. And all it will do is try to sell shares at a higher and higher and higher price, forget the goods and services. One is a means to sell the shares, one is a means. So what are you here in the business of? Are you here in the business of serving your customers? Or are you here in the business of getting bought by somebody and moving on to something else? Essentially, it comes down to, are you here as a long-term entrepreneur? Or are you here as a short-term serial entrepreneur trying to make a quick buck again and again and again and again? Right? There are people who are successful in both. I personally am much more on the side of the long-term entrepreneur. It's going to take time to build businesses and build it the right way, and that's my belief. So a lot depends on your philosophy. So it's not just youngsters. I mean, I would imagine that if you have a business and you have the next generation coming into your business, perhaps they should share your values about why you were in the business, why your forefathers were in the business, and why their great-grandchildren should be in the business, what exactly the business is, and what is that unique customer insight you have, and why is it that you'll become that extraordinary dominant force that'll be hugely profitable in that particular business you're in. All the best. Yeah. More questions? Any more?
Yeah.
Sir. I just send the microphone to you, sir.
Mayorji, it's really interesting things that we have learned this afternoon from you. One question that was haunting me, in fact, it has been haunting me since a long time, and you discussed it today, was the advertising part of, this thing that we may or may not spend as much of revenue on the advertising and yet built up a brand or, this thing. It seems, very, very difficult at the moment, especially in our field also. We can take or discuss a few names, like Carrot Lane you mentioned, or it may be Blue Stone, which has been, right now funded by few, dignitaries. My question is that all these two brands that I have mentioned just now are not really surviving, because of the product line only. They are surviving basically because of the heavy advertising also that they are doing. So what you suggested for us, companies like maybe my company, which doesn't have that big an advertising budget, these companies have been funded by VC funds over and over again, and you might be knowing 10 times more than that, than I know. So please just give me some insight.
So, again, I'm a slightly different investor from many other VC mindsets. Most VCs invest for a 3 to 5 year term. So they say, I'm going to give you a lot of money, spend it all. At the end of it, show me that you have more customers coming in. Don't worry about the top line. Don't worry about the bottom line. By then, I'll sell you. So VCs get into many such companies, put pressures on the promoters to advertise and spend a lot of money. I can tell you, my friends, many of my friends who run these companies were running very profitable companies before a VC got in and said, now please become unprofitable. They're driven by the investors to become unprofitable because some investors have a belief that if you're able to show more people coming in, to your company over the short term, then they can increase the valuation. In truth, I don't believe that works. In truth, I believe the only secular, long-term way to get customers into your brand is to have a remark-worthy brand where there's something differentiated that you have. Also, these things come and go. We had a big crash in the year 2001. If you remember the dot-com crash, we had, the Lehman Brothers crisis in 2008. We had Greece in 2010 and 2012. You have no idea. 2 years from now, there may be another crash, and none of these valuations may come true. The only people who will survive then are the people who have positive cash flow, who actually earn more than they spend, who actually have something where they're able to get a higher premium, but spend less money because they have a unique product where they can get a higher premium and more profits and have a lower expense because they have a lower marketing cost. It comes down to your philosophy. My belief is still that long-term companies that are built on sound economic principles will always win over the short term. I am not qualified to comment on Blue Stone and Carrot Lane and others. They may be in the crowd, but I do understand broadly as a measure that short-sighted investors put lots of pressure on companies to just grow the top line at the entire expense of the bottom line. I also believe that this can be disastrous. And in the end, that entrepreneur ends up losing the company Because what will happen is you sell it, then the entrepreneur has to leave, right? So it's kind of pointless. So the question again in your head is, do you want to be a long-term entrepreneur building one business for your life? Or do you want to be a short-term entrepreneur running, trying to do businesses every 3 or 4 years? It again comes down to that and your personal philosophy, sir. I hope that answers your question. More questions?
What Mahesh, you've really done is really synced in the theme of the forum that we had, and that's Tomorrow at the Edge. And I urge you all to really look at your businesses. I think few learnings about remarkable worthiness, few learnings about how word of mouth is extremely important in our business has been great. So I request you all to please join me with a big round of applause for Mahesh Murthy. Very insightful, very futuristic. And Stephen, if you can please join me and give a small token of appreciation to Mahesh.